Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is our season finale of Beyond the Mill. I am so happy to be here with you and see you here and to talk to my wonderful colleague and friend, Dr. Chinyere Suji, who in May, right, 21st, you will release your book.
Yes.
Yes.
Boundaries of Love.
Boundaries of Love. So I have it pre-ordered, so I can't wait to get it on my iPad.
Lovely.
So before we get into the juicy topics of interracial relationships, which is the topic of the day, I always like to ask our guest on Beyond the Mill, like, what brought you here? What brought you to Rutgers? Tell us a little bit about your journey here and what do you do and how can people find you on campus?
Okay. So my name is Chinyere Osuji, and I'm a professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice. And I had a prior stint on the East Coast, but I'm originally from Chicago. So I kind of ping-ponged back and forth across the country. I did a master's at Harvard, did a PhD at UCLA, and then did a postdoc at Penn at the Center for Africana Studies there, and then I segued into a position here at Rutgers, Camden.
Now, I can't remember, did we come the same year,
Yes,
2013?
So we're the same year.
Same year, cool. So I'm going to ask a question that everybody wants to know. First, to get it started, are you in an interracial relationship now? Were you?
I'm not in an interracial relationship right now. I'm not in a relationship
Okay,
right now.
so what was it that sparked your interest in this topic? Because you've been researching this for a long time. So we see the book again here that's coming out in May, but it goes back years and years of research. Like, what year did you start to research this topic, and what sparked your interest in
oh my gosh, yeah.
interracial relationships?
So I had a white boyfriend, and he broke my heart. And I'm just So I have always I went to college, and I realized that there were all these black people that weren't from Africa, like me and my parents, and weren't from America, from the United States. They're from other areas of the world, including Latin America and the Caribbean. And people know about Jamaica, of course, and like the English-speaking Caribbean. But I became aware of this whole population of black people in the Spanish-speaking Americas. I had a friend, a former roommate of mine, who told me one day, like, yes, I'm Colombian, and my dad is black and my mother is white. And I was like, what? I don't understand. She's just like my friend, I'm like, you're just a Colombian friend I have, And she's a friend who's Colombian, right? And I came to realize that, there's this rich history of black people across the diaspora that I had never been taught about. I took a class called African World Perspective, and I learned that Brazil received 4 million Africans as enslaved people, and that's something like 10 to 11 times greater than the United States received. So there's this huge population of black people there. So I was like, it's all fun facts, what have you. But then I became interested in affirmative action policy because Brazil, just as we were starting to try to dismantle this affirmative action in our higher education, Brazil was starting to implement it. And so there were what they call quotas for poor people who are Afro-descendants, for people who are indigenous. And so I was like, I'm going to go to UCLA. So I went to Harvard, studied race and policy, and I was like, this isn't a good match. And then I went to UCLA to study race in Brazil. And I was like, I'm gonna do Brazil. I'm a Brazilianist. I'm interested in racial inequality in Brazil. And I get there and I'm like, whoa, there's so many interracial couples here. I was shocked. So I was from Chicago. Like, people don't mix as much there. And I was like, that's so interesting, but whatever. I'm gonna be a Brazilianist. I'm gonna study affirmative action policy in Brazil. And I get to Sao Paulo, my first time in Brazil, and I was like, where are all the interracial couples? Brazil is a society that's known for its race mixture, right? Like, we're all mixed. Like, everybody thinks about Brazil as like a place where people of different colors intermingle, intermarry, do all sorts of stuff, and produce people across a range of color. I went to Sao Paulo, and I was surprised to see that white people hung out with white people in white neighborhoods. Black people were in neighborhoods with black and brown people predominantly, and some white sprinkled in. And there was a whole neighborhood that was Liberdade, that was where the Japanese people had settled originally, and was still populated largely by Japanese. So it was a very segregated environment. I was like, I see more interracial couples in LA than in Sao Paulo. what's going on. And that led to this book project.
Okay. So tell us what is going on with this. But I also know that you were not crazy about this book cover before the book was released. So
You put me out like that.
right. So what was it about this book cover? And then we went back and forth with some of the options. And you settled on this, but I mean, let us everyone know, like, what were some of the issues you had with the book cover?
Okay, so when I looked at this cover, I thought that looks like a couple that could be in Brazil or America, but really looks like an American couple. That's fine, okay. And then when I looked at the couple, when I looked at the children in particular, I remember thinking that this child over here looks actually a lot like the kids who I'd seen who were the products of interracial couples.
Oh.
And that child over there, I didn't think he looked like his son.
Okay.
Because I was like, he's darker than his father. And so in my family, we had this joke that the book should really be called, like, When She Cheats. Because I was like, those don't look like his kids. But, it is what it is, And so, there was another cover that I was debating about, and I was like, you know what? I'm done. Mommy, which do you like more? Mommy's like, this one. I'm like, okay, Mom. So mother's choice.
Good. I saw the other choice too, so I think you made the right choice. I think your mom made the right choice too.
Yes.
Thank
you, Lillian Osuji.
Right. Because I don't know. I think that's a argument could be made either way. I mean, these kids definitely look like they have different features. But
the reality of families
Right.
is that sometimes people have blended families,
Absolutely.
and I encountered that in my research, and we all know that sometimes people have one relationship that doesn't work out, and so you end up having kids from that relationship, and then you end up in another one. So that could be the story here.
It could be the story. I don't think it was the story that your book cover is trying to tell.
No.
Like, who's this
But they're
kid's
happy.
father?
But the thing is, they are happy.
Yeah.
I do like that. I like that they're all smiling at one another.
Now, let me ask you this. What if it were switched? Like, the editors or the illustrators, whoever they came up with this concept, did it make a difference that the woman was white and the man was black? What are your thoughts on that? Because we definitely, from your research, there's definitely different rates of interracial relationships.
Absolutely.
That vary. So it's not like it's a normal distribution of, equally men or women entering these. It's very segmented in terms of you will see many more men in this case. So what are your thoughts on
You're
how
absolutely
the
right.
illustrator paired this?
Okay. So, buy my book, Boundaries of Love.
Right.
And so when thinking from a marketing perspective, you're absolutely right in the sense that there are more couples involving white women with black men. And so from a marketing perspective, it would make sense to have on the cover the most common type of black-white couple that there is, right? So I think in that respect, I really like the cover in that it shows that.
Okay. So, I know it's like a catchy topic, but I'm going to mute this for right now. I haven't read the book yet because it's not out, but I did go through extensive notes like that you have about the book. And you talk about a lot of these ideas. When you think of relationships, you think of just people are getting together because of love. But it was like these mixtures and families, wanting to, quote unquote, whitening their lives. And as a researcher, I know you have to be professional. You have to kind of take a step back. And you couldn't say things in the moment, but looking at some of the transcripts of the interviews, were there like OMG moments or like, I can't believe you said that moments? And like, I know you couldn't say it when they were talking to you, but after you got back to your room or whatever, like, what were your thoughts with some of the things that they were saying in terms of
I think that we should be more specific, Oscar, for the audience.
Please, be more specific because,
Sure. So I remember that there was one couple who I interviewed in Rio de Janeiro, and the woman was a large woman, and she was white, and the husband was black. And I think that in our heads we have the stereotype that in black-white couples, if you have a white woman with a black husband, that like she's usually less attractive than your average white woman or white women who pair up with white men. Mm. But in this situation, it was a very particular situation because she lived in the home that her parents had, and once they passed away, she inherited the home. And she'd said that she'd always had a preference for black people ever since she was a little kid, that she always brought black friends home. And I remember her telling me that her parents used to get really frustrated, especially her mother. Her mother would nickname her slave ship.
Wow.
Because she was always bringing black friends home, right? So I remember being shocked at that, and like it was like kind of funny because she's telling me jokingly, like, naviu negrero, like, you know, like, it's not funny, but it's, you know, but we're laughing, so. And then, so she knew that her parents would never be happy with her with a black man, and so she didn't date black men while they were alive. But then once they passed on, she was able to date whomever she wanted. And so she ended up with this man whose name, I believe I called Danielle in the book. And he was a black man who was a lovely person. And so when people talk about status exchange often, whether demographers or people, regular people, like, oh yeah, to compensate for being a low status racial category or a member of a low status racial category like black, you have to compensate for it by having high levels of education or high occupational status, higher than the white person in the relationship. And what I saw in this situation was that the white woman, Adriana, she was middle class. She was doing really well for herself. What she'd seen over time was that her neighborhood had progressively become poorer and poorer, but she still owned a house. It was a nice house. And her husband or partner, he lived off of her. So he had a nice situation going where he didn't have a job, and he told me about his prior spouse, who was also a white woman, who was also large, and how she had passed away from cancer, and how he was able to receive her pension. So he had received her pension when she passed away. So he had, you know, a nice, cushy life.
Wow.
At least that's how it seemed on the outside, right?
Right. So, I mean, you mentioned their size. So I think it was a significant part of the story. Do you think he was like going for a certain type of woman in this case, or?
I think that he was going for a certain type of woman, but also these women were going for a certain type of man, right? So the reason I brought up Adriana's size is because while I was there interviewing them, this is the ethnographic eye you have to have. I remember her like calling him like Danielle, and he would come and he would lift her out of the chair. She was handicapped, right? She didn't have the ability to get in and out of her own chair, and so in a way it was a different type of exchange that was happening, right? In which he was able-bodied and a man, and he had a nice life living with her, but she also received a caretaker who cared for her.
Cool. So that's part of what I wanted to get at, but the other part was this deep concept of whitening, like your race line, that some of your interviewees stated, like their family wanted. Or, in contrast, blackening, like they would get upset if they were blackening their color line. So can you talk and share with the audience perhaps some of those quotes or whatever that really struck out when people were like, you know, like, I want to whiten up our, you know.
So the context is that in the history of Brazil, right, there's this moment like after abolition when Brazilian elites are like, oh my God, our country is so brown and black. We've got all these freed black and brown people and very few white people. What are we going to do? I know, we'll import our whites. So they brought lots of Europeans to Brazil to help industrialize the nation, right? Because this was like when industrial revolution was really taking hold in Brazil.
And this was the solution for the race problem, right?
Yeah, we don't have a race problem. They're going to all be white over time. Because the idea was that by mixing with blacks, they'd produce lighter offspring. The idea was that looking at the actual numbers, that infant mortality of blacks was lower than it was for whites, so blacks were going to die off. And so eventually, Brazil would be a white nation, just like the United States or Germany or Italy or what have you, because that was the goal. The goal was to be an industrialized Western society that was white. It was so linked to whiteness. And so there's this understanding of whitening ideology that took hold that still plays a role in Brazilian society even to this day. There's this notion that by engaging in upward mobility as a brown or black person, if you get more education, if you like make more money, that you have this potential for whitening. Because now, on the one hand, maybe if you're light skinned, you can like get your nose job, You can get your hair straightened, and people would just think you're white. You're a descendant of Italians, right? Maybe a little bit of black people in the background. Like in Brazil, they have this saying a foot in the kitchen to refer to having a little bit of black ancestry. And like, I have a foot in the kitchen. Some white people say. So then there's that element to whitening, in which you can physically whiten your appearance, stay out of the sun, and you're good, right? But then there are other aspects in which you can pursue relationships with lighter people, especially white people, to produce offspring that are lighter. Right? And then there's the issue of maybe you only spend time with white people, so you're whitening your social network. So this is a very potent ideology that's run its course through Brazilian society. But then you've got this black movement that really takes off once the dictatorship is over in the late 70s. And all of a sudden you've got black people who are mobilizing for their rights, especially in the 80s, starting in the 80s. And with this mobilization comes an appreciation for black people. And not just black culture, because Brazilians love samba, we all love samba. Brazilians love samba, taking cultural elements that, belong to black people and appropriating it for non-blacks or for the nation. Not that Americans would know anything about that, right? Yeah, but that's a very strong current in Brazilian society where we eat African food. Like, we've all got this African cultural element. But with black mobilization, all of a sudden you're like, no, black people matter. Black lives matter as people today. Not just in the past, not the foot in the kitchen, but today. And so there's growing appreciation for darkening, even as policies shifted to allow more blacks and brown people into universities, for example, into bureaucratic positions in the state. And so with this has come this coolness of being black. It's cool to be black. And so what I saw in my book in the Rio de Janeiro section, not in the Los Angeles section, were several white women who referred to themselves, or had other people refer to them as negras frustradas, frustrated black women, in which they really wanted to be black. I had one woman, Angela, I call her in the book, who said, I love your hair. I was born on the wrong continent. I should have been over there in Africa. I love black culture. I love black men. I love black religion. And I want to have black children. So I'm going to find myself a black man to do this.
Wow.
But then she had a little bit of a surprise when her daughter was born, and her daughter looked just like her. And she said, oh my gosh, you couldn't have been black.
Wow.
Oh, pretinha, you couldn't have been a little black girl. She looked just like her. So for her, and for everybody around her, the daughter was white, because that's how race works in Brazil.
So did you do your interviews in Portuguese, or?
Of course. Claro que sim.
Claro que sim. Right. So let's open it up. I still have some more questions, but let's open it up to our audience because I know they want to get in on this conversation. And so, Zane.
Hi, I'm Zane.
Yeah.
Oh. Meu nome é Zaja. Prazer. Eu falo português um pouco.
Tá bom, mas as pessoas não podem entender, né?
So I became what's the term you use for Brazilianista?
Brazilianist.
Yes.
Brazilianista in Portuguese, yeah.
So I had a similar experience when I went to Salvador, and I observed a lot of the things that you observed as well. Did you visit there? Did you notice any things there? I know for me, when I went to Salvador, the first time I went there was with a graduate student group, and the second time I went there I was alone. And there's so many race-related things that happened. It's for me as a black woman, being in Salvador, Brazil, and not being poor and being in certain places, it was just weird. You'd see people looking at you, or people assuming you were, a sex worker because you're there, or you're wearing a certain outfit, or you're at the hotel. We were staying at a nice hotel, and women who looked like me stayed there. The likelihood of them being there is because they were with someone else. And so it was an interesting experience how Brazilians really didn't talk about race. We're all Brazilians. It's almost like they act like it doesn't exist, but there's layers and layers of race issues just all over everything, with education, employment, you name it. So I'm just curious if you went to Salvador, and what did you observe while you were there? I haven't been to Sao Paulo yet, but I heard about it.
But that doesn't sound positive.
I heard about it.
So I conducted my research. So I went to Sao Paulo the first time. I was like, I'm not going back there. And I did my research in Rio de Janeiro.
Okay.
But yes, I was lucky enough to have spent time in Salvador. I went once for Carnival. And I went another time, and then just to hang out in Salvador. With a friend. And Salvador, so for those of you guys who don't know, Salvador is located in the northeast of Brazil. And if you think about like how in the United States, most black people in the United States live in the south of the country, right? Brazil's like flipped, where most people who are black and brown live in the north. Historically, a major slave port, right? Port for enslaved Africans. And so being in Salvador has well, for me personally, I love Salvador. Because I love the unabashed blackness of the people there. I'm Nigerian. I can eat my akara, but they call it akaraje, you know? And it's my favorite Nigerian food. So selling it on the street, I'm like, yes, give me, right? And I could eat all sorts of like traditional Nigerian foods that I eat at home. My mom makes it. And like I could eat that everywhere. But at the same time, I know that I was only spending time in really touristy areas and in wealthier areas. So I'm sure I probably wasn't paying as much attention because I was doing the touristy thing. But it's funny that you mentioned sex workers, because that was definitely a theme for several of the black women who I spoke to in Rio de Janeiro. They talked about how, unlike couples involving black men with white women with white men, if you were in places like Copacabana, Ipanema, Leblon, the major touristy areas, wealthy areas of Rio, people would think that you were with your John. And depending on how pale your husband was, people would not even think he was Brazilian. There's this understanding for Brazilians that the typical Brazilian is a brown Brazilian, maybe a little paler, maybe a little paler or a little darker. But somebody who's really, really pale, não é brasileiro, you know, it's not Brazilian, even though there are plenty of pale people in Brazil. So then there was this dynamic in which couples talked about having to maneuver not being seen as participants in sex tourism or the sex trade.
Gotcha.
Oh, and also I had an incident in Rio de Janeiro, not in Salvador, in which I was waiting for a bus, hanging out in Lapa, waiting for a bus, and this older man who had, he was wearing in a black suit and a black hat, and he had curls. He's like, sex for money.
Wow.
And I was like, and I was thinking in Portuguese. I was in Brazilian mode, you know. I'm like, what? Wait, prostituta, não sou. You know, I just started speaking Portuguese. Blah, 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 blah. He's like, oh, sorry. I'm like, you should be. Like, immediately the English like came back, and I actually write about this in the appendix of my book, because I talk about how do you do this type of research, you know, especially being a black woman, being an American, being Nigerian, like all those different identities came to fore when I was doing this research in Brazil, and also in Los Angeles, because I did do this research also in Los Angeles.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the LA part,
Sure.
the U.S. perspective, but let's get some more from Stacey and Daria. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask too.
Everybody will ask about the U.S.
So I was wondering if, because I heard you talk about Los Angeles subjects, if you did any comparative study of the reasons that motivate these interracial relationships. Because of course, the narrative of interracial relationships in the United States is that it's all about romantic love. And the narrative that you just described, you know, quite forwardly, although shockingly, in Brazil, is that they're about, right, this kind of whitening or blackening ideology, which is very different, right, from the narrative that we hear. So I'm wondering if you did any comparative study about what subjects were willing to tell you about the reasons why they engaged in interracial relationships in Los Angeles and how that compared or contrasted with what you found in Brazil.
Absolutely, great question. So the entire book is comparative. So every chapter is a comparative chapter comparing how people in Rio and LA understand their relationships and their families. And so as far as preferences and patterns, I talk about the privilege of preferences in my first chapter. I talk about people having this romantic career, if you will. And so in Rio, a lot of the women were very explicit about, white women were explicit about desires for black men. The black men were like, I'm just gonna like take what comes, like I'm seeking out brown women, they're not wanting me. One guy told me, and only Brad Pitt emerges, like you're gonna go for Brad, right? And so so there were different ways that people talked about it. And also in Rio, people were talking about, some of the black women were talking about previous experiences that were negative with black men. And so they were seeking out experiences with white men to compensate for that. And white guys were doing something completely different. I'll talk about that later if you ask. But so in LA, people were not talking about the same preferences, or people were not overt in discussing their preferences. The people who were the most overt were the white men who I interviewed. They said, it was almost like a 31 flavors kind of discussion, where they're like, I love exotic women. And exotic could mean anything from Italian, Jewish, Portuguese, Asian, African American, what have you. So there were several white men who talked about that. But many of the women were like, I fell in love with what was around me, who people, I've dated. A lot of the white women said I dated only white men until I met this guy, and he was wonderful, so I married him. And I have several black women who said, I dated black men, and then I ended up with this guy. I only had one woman who said, I like white guys, and those are the guys who I'm interested in, and that's who I date. But most of the women were talked about being open to people of different colors. And then when I spoke to white women, I talked about black men, they also said, like, I used to date black girls, and now I'm with a white girl. Or some of them talked about, not a preference, but talked a lot about circumstance, like the structures that are around them and how that forced them into particular relationships. So there's this understanding for the black men who I interviewed that I'm in predominantly white spaces for work, or I live in a white neighborhood. I grew up in a multiracial neighborhood, and so that's why I date a lot of non-black women. So there are different trajectories and understandings of how people ended up in this final destination of having a partner of a different color. But in both places, what I see is that whites have this privilege of preference, right? In which, in Brazil, the white women are like, I like black guys, and the white guys in Los Angeles are like, I like exotic women. And the white men in Rio were saying, I tend to be with women who are outside of the norm. So the last woman I dated had schizophrenia. The last woman I dated was blind. The last woman that I dated, so it was like really like women who were marginalized in a variety of ways. And that was a pattern that I saw for the white men who I interviewed in Rio.
Almost like a savior complex type of idea.
They didn't see themselves that way, right? And so, and that's why I want to push back on this idea that they saw themselves as whitening, because whitening in this society, it's very much about black consciousness raising. Whitening is super taboo. Right. Like saying, I want to be with that black guy because I want to have whiter kids, or darker kids. Well, not excuse me. I want to be with that white guy because I want to have lighter kids is super taboo in the Brazilian context.
Taboo here as well. I mean, did we all see like that video of the
NFL the videotape, they were bragging though. They were bragging, team light skin, right? But that, when I was interviewing people so it gets complicated, right? Because like when I was interviewing people in Rio, none of the black people said, I'm marrying this person to have lighter children. But then their white husbands or wives who I had interviewed, the white husbands, like, oh yeah, she wanted to style, right? You would have to buy producto, all this product to do hair.
This is fascinating.
You're right.
So, I'm curious not so much about the motivations for the relationships, although I have a lot to think about based on what you said. I'm curious about the acceptance and what predeterminants or conditions you might have observed in your research lead to more or less acceptance within the families, within the social circles, within the ecosystem that this couple travels throughout, whatever composition the couple might be.
So I talk about how in the United States, what I saw happening with these couples was an exclusive integration in which, and I looked particularly at how white families accepted these black in-laws, because we know, in both societies there's a lot of racial inequality. And if you're thinking about families, a central place where wealth gets inherited, where people are taking care of one another, we know in both societies whites have a lot more resources than blacks do. And so I was interested, well, how are they integrating these black in-laws? So in the United States, when I talk to people in Los Angeles, white families often lived far away and were often hostile to the relationship, particularly if they involved black men with white women. And so those couples experienced more hostility. Over time, though, the white in-laws came to accept those black spouses, but they saw them so rarely that they were largely inconsequential for the experiences of the couple on the everyday level.
And did that acceptance come like post-children, or perhaps there were no children in a relationship and they just accepted the relationship itself? Because children can change a lot of things too when you have grandchildren or whatever.
They can, but what I saw was all across the board. Whether people had children or did not have children at the time that I interviewed them, there was like, okay, they're okay now, right? At the same time, I don't want to say that all the couples experience this type of hostility, because there are plenty of white families where they're like, oh yeah, we love her, we love him, right? And this especially happened with relationships involving white men with black women. And the types of black women that intermarried into these relationships that I interviewed, many of them were not necessarily seen as black by outsiders. They talked about being mistaken for Mexicans, because it's LA, or like being mistaken for people of other ethnic backgrounds and racial backgrounds.
So do you think it made it better for them?
It made it easier
right.
for them to integrate into
so it's still
these
that
white
hierarchy
families.
type of situation.
Yeah. Absolutely,
right.
A pigmentocracy,
Right,
if you
right.
will. But again, they didn't play, for a lot of the couples who I interviewed, white people, their white extended family members lived in other cities and other states, so they weren't very consequential for their everyday lives. Unlike
They're
Brazil.
not having cookouts all the time like us.
They are not. You know where they're having cookouts? Brazil.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to finish answering your question, because in Rio, what I saw was an inclusive discrimination that was happening, in which white parents, extended family members also weren't accepting. They didn't like the fact that their white children or family members were dating and marrying a black partner. And they would be very rude to them. Things like ignoring them, but they saw them every Sunday, every week. You saw that same black person. And so you couldn't avoid them. And some of them, I remember one woman in particular mentioned how her white mother said, oh, I just love Robinson now because, I don't see him as a black person. I see him as a white person now. So by changing how she sees him, she was now able to treat him like a human being. I was interested in how white extended family members understand or the process of integrating this black spouse. So I think that's part of why you're picking up on that. But I would say that the black partners did not see themselves as trying to ingratiate themselves to their white extended family members. They're like, I love this person, and if you have a problem with that, we're married, still having kids. Like, it's unfortunate, right? I wish that, you saw us as equals. And I remember one man, Edward, I believe I call him, talked about how it was the most dehumanizing experience of his life when his white wife, her family totally did not accept him and treated them badly, disowned her, essentially. But what are you going to do? Life goes on, right? And that's the story of Black America, right? We experience oppression, but life goes on. You still have to, do your best to have a good life for yourself and your family. The most shocking thing, I think, was that slave ship thing. That was the most shocking.
How are the kids?
So the kids were doing terrible. I was so sad for them. I'm just kidding. It's not true at all. I was not so much interested in the children because my larger question was really about ethnic and racial boundaries and how they work. We always say, in Brazil, race works differently from how it works in the United States. So I was interested in this thing called blackness, this thing called whiteness, and how they play out similarly or differently. So I have a chapter that's devoted to how the parents identify their children. And so what I see happening is that in Rio de Janeiro, depending on the phenotype, the child might be seen as black, might be seen as white, or might be seen as something else, like mestizo, mixed, meio termo, in the middle, moreno, this ambiguous term that could just mean brown or but in the way that they were talking about it, they meant not white. And I talked to them about what this means for affirmative action policy. And so in Brazil, in Rio, when I spoke to the parents, they were like, my child would qualify for affirmative action in higher education if they were not white. So the parents who had white children were like, oh no, she doesn't qualify. He doesn't qualify. No. In the United States, when I was talking to parents in Los Angeles, everybody said, my child is biracial. Biracial, mixed, biracial, mixed. And so when I asked them about, because they would say they had this additive understanding of their child's identity in which the child is both black and white equally together, right? So when I asked about affirmative action policy, all of a sudden that white part starts like disengaging a little bit, and they're like, they're African American, they're biracial, but they were like, it's like the equality of the identity starts to like tip in favor of blackness when they're talking about policy, affirmative action policy.
Right.
And so in thinking about also the boundaries of blackness and whiteness, when I spoke to parents in Rio, everybody's like, my child is going to be black. I have black babies because it's a gene that dominates. Black people have more biological constitution that's stronger than white people do. But then when the kids came out, they're like, oh, that's not a black kid. That's a white kid. Or that's a mixed kid. Or that's a mestizo, moreno, etc. But the most common terms that parents in Rio used were black and then white. And then other terms. Whereas in LA, it's like, my child will be biracial. My child was born, my child is biracial. There's like no change in that. So I think that this points to larger issues in the sense that we're from Chicago, yay, and Chicago is a segregated city. But the reality is the United States is a country that is segregated. Like all of our cities are hyper segregated. When you look at traditionally they've used the index of dissimilarity in the past to look at cities and to understand segregation. And when you look at most cities, we're like in the 80s and 90s on that perspective, meaning that like 80% of all black people would need to move for there to be like no segregation. And Brazil's not like that. It's like in the 40s and 50s. Okay, so it's much less segregated than any city in the United States, or most cities in the United States, I should say. But I think that we've put a lot of pressure on interracial couples and their multiracial children. I think that it's been a cop-out or a way of not really doing anything serious to ameliorate racial inequality and injustice and discrimination in our society. Say everybody's gonna just like mix and it'll go away. Racism will be, in the past. And I was living in California, right, which is sees itself as very progressive. And a lot of people would tell me things like, oh, racism will be over because we're all mixing, we're all gonna be brown one day. And I was just like, I like being black. There's that element, and then there's the other element of but even Brazil has had centuries of race mixing, and there are people who are lighter and darker, and we still see a hierarchy in which whiteness experiences more privileges than blackness does. So I think that we've used interracial marriage and race mixing as a trope that's unfair to the people who are in those relationships, because most interracial couples love each other. They're loving families, right? They're just regular people living life like everybody else. And to expect that they're going to solve the race problem is just ridiculous. And it's lazy on our part, right? It's activism and policy making that will change those things.
So we don't have much more time, but I do want to ask this question. Hopefully that's a quick answer. We focus on black-white relationships because that's the research in your book. How do you see it similar to just intercultural relationships? So it doesn't have to be a black-white scenario. What are some perhaps similarities that your research can generalize to, and some key differences that you can maybe answer in 60 seconds?
Sure. Well, I think just in writ large, people should love whomever they want to love, right? And what we see with intermarriage and interracial dating is that we like to talk the talk but not walk the walk. There's this great book by Bonilla Silva that talks about how people are okay with interracial marriage as long as it's or dating, as long as it's not them or their family members, And so I think that can play out for people of a variety of different backgrounds. But overall, I think that love is a beautiful thing and it should be celebrated.
Right.
And I think that people should be free to love and live with whomever they want to.
I think that's a great way to end the show. Again, I think it's May 21st, right? All right, Boundaries of Love comes out. Make sure you get that. I want to please join me in thanking my guest today, Dr. Chinyere Nsuji. I always want to leave with parting thoughts, so I thought this was fitting today. In the evening of life, we will be judged on love alone. So I think that's a great parting thought. And this is the season finale. Thank you all. 6 episodes. Thank you to everybody. This was great.
Thank you.
See you in season 2, hopefully. And again, this is it. Thank you.